Occasionally, when there was some more than usually interesting inquest upon a parish child who had been overlooked in turning up a bedstead or inadvertently scalded to death when there happened to be a washing, though the latter accident was very scarce, anything approaching to a washing being of rare occurrence in the farm, the jury would take it into their heads to ask troublesome questions, or the parishioners would rebelliously affix their signatures to a remonstrance, but these impertinences were speedily checked by the evidence of the surgeon and the testimony of the beadle, the former of whom had always opened the body and found nothing inside, which was very probable indeed, and the latter of whom invariably swore whatever the parish wanted, which was very self-devotional. Besides, the board made periodical pilgrimages to the farm, and always sent the beadle the day before to say they were coming. The children were neat and clean to behold when they went, and what more would the people have? It could not be expected that this system of farming would produce any very extraordinary or luxuriant crop. Oliver Twist's 8th birthday found him a pale, thin child, somewhat diminutive in stature and decidedly small in circumference, but It could not be expected that this system of farming would produce any very extraordinary or luxuriant crop. Oliver Twist's 8th birthday found him a pale, thin child, somewhat diminutive in stature and decidedly small in circumference, but nature or inheritance had implanted a good, sturdy spirit in Oliver's breast. It had had plenty of room to expand, thanks to the spare diet of the establishment, and perhaps to this circumstance may be attributed his having any 8th birthday at all. Be this as it may, however, it was his 8th birthday, and he was keeping it in the coal cellar with a select party of 2 other young gentlemen, who, after participating with him in a sound threshing, had been locked up the rain for atrociously presuming to be hungry. When Mrs. Mann, the good lady of the house, was unexpectedly startled by the apparition of Mr. Bumble, the beadle, striving to undo the wicket of the garden gate. "Goodness gracious, is that you, Mr. Bumble, sir?" said Mrs. Mann, thrusting her head out of the window in well-affected ecstasies of joy. Susan, take Oliver and them 2 brats upstairs and wash 'em directly." "My heart alive, Mr. Bumble, how glad I am to see you, surely." Now Mr. Bumble was a fat man, and a choleric one, so instead of responding to this open-hearted salutation in a kindred spirit, he gave the little wicket a tremendous shake, and then bestowed upon it a kick, which could have emanated from no leg but a beadle's. "Lor, only think," said Mrs. Mann, running out, for the 3 boys had been removed by this time. "Only think of that I should have forgotten that the gate was bolted on the inside on account of them dear children. Walk in, sir, walk in, pray, Mr. Bumble, do, sir." Although this invitation was accompanied with a curtsy that might have softened the heart of a church warden, it by no means mollified the beadle. "Do you think this respectful or proper conduct, Mrs. Mann?" inquired Mr. Bumble, grasping his cane, "to keep the parish officers awaiting at your garden gate, when they come here upon parochial business connected with the parochial orphans? Are you aware, Mrs. Mann, that you are, as I may say, a parochial delegate and a stipendiary?" "I am sure, Mr. Bumble, that I was only a-telling 1 or 2 of the dear children as is so fond of you, that it was you a-coming," replied Mrs. Mann with great humility. Mr. Bumble had a great idea of his oratorical powers and his importance. He had displayed the one and vindicated the other. He relaxed. Well, well, Mrs. Mann, he replied in a calmer tone. It may be as you say, it may be. Lead the way in, Mrs. Mann, for I come on business, and have got something to say. Mrs. Mann ushered the beetle into a small parlor with a brick floor, placed a seat for him, and officiously deposited his cocked hat and cane on the table before him. Mr. Bumble wiped from his forehead the perspiration which his walk had engendered, glanced complacently at the cocked hat, and smiled. Yes, he smiled. Beetles are but men. And Mr. Bumble smiled. Now, don't you be offended at what I am going to say, observed Mrs. Mann with captivating sweetness. You've had a long walk, you know, or I wouldn't mention it. Now will you take a little drop of something, Mr. Bumble? Not a drop, said Mr. Bumble, waving his right hand in a dignified but still placid manner. I think you will, said Mrs. Mann, who had noticed the tone of the refusal and the gesture that had accompanied it. Just a little drop, with a little cold water and a lump of sugar, Mr. Bumble coughed. Now, just a little drop, said Mrs. Mann persuasively. What is it? Inquired the beetle. Why, it's that I'm obliged to keep a little off in the house to put in the blessed infant's daffy when they ain't well, Mr. Bumble replied Mrs. Mann as she opened a corner cupboard and took down a bottle and glass. It's gin. Do you give the children daffy, Mrs. Mann? Inquired Bumble, following with his eyes the interesting process of mixing. Ah, bless 'em, that I do, dear as it is, replied the nurse. I couldn't see 'em suffer before my very eyes, you know, sir. No, said Mr. Bumble approvingly. No, you could not. You are a humane woman, Mrs. Mann. Here she set down the glass. I shall take an early opportunity of mentioning it to the board, Mrs. Mann. He drew it towards him. You feel as a mother, Mrs. Mann? He stirred the gin and water. I drink your health with cheerfulness, Mrs. Mann, and he swallowed half of it. And now about business, said the beetle, taking out a leathern pocketbook. The child that was half baptized, Oliver Twist, is 8 years old today. Bless him, interposed Mrs. Mann, inflaming her left eye with the corner of her apron. And notwithstanding an offered reward of £10, which was afterwards increased to £20, notwithstanding the most superlative, and I may say supernatural exertions on the part of this parish, said Bumble, we have never been able to discover who is his father, or what is his mother's settlement, name, or condition. Mrs. Mann raised her hands in astonishment, but added after a moment's reflection, how comes he to have any name at all, then? The beetle drew himself up with great pride and said, I invented it. You, Mr. Bumble? Aye, Mrs. Mann. We name our foundlings in alphabetical order. The last name was a S, Swubble. I named him. This was a T, Twist. I named him. The next one as comes will be Unwin, and the next Vilkins. I have got names ready to the end of the alphabet and all the way through it again when we come to C. Why, you're quite a literary character, sir. Why, you're quite a literary character, sir, said Mrs. Mann. Well, well, said the beetle, evidently gratified with the compliment. Perhaps I may be, Mrs. Mann. He finished the gin and water and added, Oliver being now too old to remain here, the board have determined to have him back into the house, and I have come out myself to take him there, so let me see him at once. I'll fetch him directly, said Mrs. Mann, leaving the room for that purpose, and Oliver, having by this time had as much of the outer coat of dirt which encrusted his face and hands removed as could be scrubbed off in one washing, was led into the room by his benevolent protectress. Make a bow to the gentleman, Oliver, said Mrs. Mann. Oliver made a bow, which was divided between the beetle on the chair and the cocked hat on the table. Will you go along with me, Oliver? Said Mr. Bumble in a majestic voice. Oliver was about to say that he would go along with anybody with great readiness, when, glancing upwards, he caught sight of Mrs. Mann, who had got behind the beetle's chair and was shaking her fist at him with a furious countenance. He took the hint at once, for the fist had been too often impressed upon his body not to be deeply impressed upon his recollection. Will she go with me? Inquired poor Oliver. No, she can't, replied Mr. Bumble, but she'll come and see you sometimes. This was no very great consolation to the child, but, young as he was, he had sense enough to make a feint of feeling great regret at going away. It was no very difficult matter for the boy to call the tears into his eyes. Hunger and recent ill usage are great assistants if you want to cry, and Oliver cried very naturally indeed. Mrs. Mann gave him 1,000 embraces and what Oliver wanted a great deal more, a piece of bread and butter, lest he should seem too hungry when he got to the workhouse. With the slice of bread in his hand and the little brown cloth parish cap upon his head, Oliver was then led away by Mr. Bumble from the wretched home where one kind word or look had never lighted the gloom of his infant years.